It is precisely here, however, where the prodigal is at his very lowest, that the turn begins to take place. In a very wonderful way, the dynamics of what happened next perfectly fit this great season of Lent. In effect, the prodigal has found himself in a situation of enforced fasting. And notice the result. Starving, he remembers the source which had been sustaining his life ever since he rejected it, his father. For the prodigal's hunger, remember, is the product of wasting the life his father had given him in the form of coins to provide for his needs. The next line is wonderful. In verse 17 we hear, "Coming to his senses, he thought, 'How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat, but here I am, dying from hunger.'" There is a deep truth hidden by the English translation in this verse, found by looking at the words, "coming to his senses." The Greek here is eishouton de elton, and literally means coming back to himself. Very beautifully, the thought that brings the prodigal back to himself is a thought about his father. This reinforces now, everybody, the positive side to what we saw negatively earlier, namely, that our identities as human creatures created in God's image are intrinsically related to and discovered only in relationship with God. What we see taking place in the prodigal, then, is precisely what has been emphasized about the practice of fasting over the past several weeks. Namely, that by forcing us to experience hunger, fasting reminds us that we are not self-sustaining nor self-generating entities, either physically or spiritually. Instead, we are dependent on others to provide for our nourishment in both spiritual and physical dimensions of life, and ultimately, the source of sustenance in both dimensions is the same: God. The verse just cited also speaks to the practice of prayer. Recall that in recent weeks, we have described prayer as a raising of the heart and mind to God, which is precisely what the prodigal figuratively does next by turning his heart and mind towards his father. For we are told the prodigal thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough to eat?" With his mind and heart now turned back toward his father, the prodigal resolves to go to him and say, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers." The turning of the mind back toward God, of course, is the act of repentance, a primary focus of the Lenten season. And within the parable, it is coupled with a confession of sin. "I have sinned," the prodigal realizes. The enforced fasting and prayer of the prodigal finally bring him to a posture of giving. Over the past several weeks, we have tied the Lenten practice of almsgiving closely to works of mercy, works which in turn are imitative of the life of God, who is mercy. Now, in the decision of the prodigal, we learn a deep lesson about this practice. Namely, we can only truly give anything of ourselves to others by first giving ourselves to God. Thus, the prodigal resolves to give himself to his father, no longer as son, but as servant. Here too we find a lesson. For while the prodigal realizes that he must return to his source of life, he does not realize that he could not ever be anything less than a son to his father. This is something that we are all in need of realizing, fellow prodigals. For each time we sin, we treat God as a taskmaster, a boss, who seeks to impose his will upon us and thereby fail to realize that he is our Father, who only ever wants us to flourish in his presence as adopted sons and daughters. This is what the prodigal realizes upon his return to his father. The Lenten practices of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving thus are meant to remind us of the very same.